When Mark Twain first visited Elmira in the fall of 1868, he was already well on his way to becoming the most famous man on earth, as poet Robertus Love would later call him. He was one of America's first cultural celebrities, a person who achieved near universal name recognition despite holding no government office or military command. He achieved this by masterfully harnessing the power of the first truly national mass media in the United States. Mark Twain was, to the newspaper, what Kim Kardashian is to Instagram. He was not just an early adopter, but somebody who intuitively understood what readers wanted, how to manipulate the industry from the inside, and how to use the popularity and accessibility of the newspaper to open up more lucrative revenue streams for himself. But when Twain arrived in Elmira, though his star was very much on the rise, his future was far from assured. He had not yet published a single book. He was in the midst of his first extended lecture tour, paving the way for what would become, largely thanks to him, the comedy club circuit. For more than a decade, Samuel Clemens had been a nomad, never staying at one address for more than a few weeks at a time, living the hard life of a steamboat pilot, a prospector, a beat reporter, a wildcat editor, a travel writer, and a road comic. He was 32 years old, and the average life expectancy for an American man born in his time was 39. Perhaps he was ready to settle down, but by his own account, he was as surprised as anybody when he fell in love with Olivia Langdon's picture, which her brother, Charlie, carried to Jerusalem in 1867 on the so-called Holy Land Cruise, which would become the subject of Mark Twain's first bestseller, The Innocents Abroad. On his first date with the Elmira College alumna, Twain took Livy Langdon and her family to see Charles Dickens read at Steinway Hall in New York City. It was New Year's Eve, 1867. Over the next year, as he crisscrossed the country by train on his American Vandal lecture tour, Twain went out of his way to book layovers in Elmira. During these visits, he inevitably proposed marriage, and was just as inevitably rejected. But he continued to plead his case in love letters, until, when he returned for Thanksgiving, Livy finally said yes. Twain hit the road again, elated, but also wary that their engagement was tentative, pending approval of Livy's parents, who, though they had always been hospitable, could not be counted on to wed their 22-year-old daughter to a man the papers frequently called a vandal, a savage, a cannibal, and the wild humorist of the Pacific Slope. On Christmas Eve, after delivering a stand-up set to a sold-out crowd in central Michigan, Twain sat up late with a fresh letter from Livy. She was getting cold feet. Spending what she feared would be the last holiday season with the family she adored, she wanted assurance that her famously itinerant would-be husband would not separate her permanently from her people and her home. After midnight on Christmas morning, Sam made an extraordinary promise.
I just don't wonder that it makes you sad to think of leaving such a home, Livy, and such household gods, for there is no other home in all the world like it, no household gods so lovable as yours anywhere. And I shall feel like a heartless highway robber when I take you away from there. You shall visit them, Livy, and so often that they cannot well realize that you are absent. You shall never know the chill that comes upon me sometimes when I feel that long absence has made me a stranger in my own home. A dull, aching consciousness that long exile has lost to me that haven of rest, that pillow of weariness, that refuge from care and trouble and pain. that type and symbol of heaven. Home. And then, away down in my heart of hearts, I yearn for the days that are gone and the phantoms of the olden time, for the faces that are vanished, for the forms I loved to see, for the voices that were music to my ear, for the restless feet that have gone out into the darkness to return no more forever. But you shall not know this great blank, this awful vacancy, this something missed, something lost, which is felt but cannot be described, this solemn, mysterious desolation. No. I, with my experience, should dread to think of your old home growing strange to you.
These words laid the foundation for the Elmira College Center for Mark Twain Studies. For Sam kept his promise. And the summer after they were married, Sam and Livy came to stay with Livy's sister, Susan Crane, at Quarry Farm. It was the first of what would become an annual, months-long pilgrimage. The next summer, Twain wrote the manuscript of what would become his second best-selling travel book, Roughing It. When the Clemens family arrived in 1874, Susan Crane had a surprise for her brother-in-law, who had recently published his first novel. The octagonal study perched at the peak of the hillside, creating panoramic views of the Chemung River Valley. Twain called it the loveliest study he ever saw, and his cozy nest. In no other space did Twain achieve greater creative productivity. I can write 10 chapters in Elmira for every one I write elsewhere, he said, and dubbed Quarry Farm the quietest of all quiet places. But it was not just the tranquility that fueled Twain's productivity. 3 daughters were born to Sam and Livy in Elmira, and the happiest seasons of their youth inspired Twain to return to his own memories of boyhood, penning a series of novels about children which reliably scandalize adults. And in Elmira, he found a community unlike any he had previously been a part of. The Langdons were radical abolitionists and station masters on the Underground Railroad. Frederick Douglass considered Elmira like a second home and said, for enlightenment, liberality, and civilization, the people have no superiors in this country or any other. When Douglass first passed through Elmira in the 1840s, Livy's father, Jervis Langdon, told him, "The family house and purse will always be at the disposal of fugitives from slavery." Olivia Lewis Langdon, while pregnant with Livy, smuggled supplies to the fugitives hiding out in the wilderness to the west of the city, among them John W. Jones. Befriended by the Langdons, Jones settled in Elmira and became one of the most notorious conductors on the Underground Railroad, shepherding more than 800 people to freedom, often disguising himself as a baggage handler and sequestering stowaways in specially designed baggage cars which Jervis Langdon had attached to passenger trains on the railroads he owned. And it wasn't just the Underground Railroad. When American Presbyterians refused to endorse the abolition of slavery, the Langdons founded their own church, installed as its minister the most radical theologian in New England, Thomas K. Beecher. He attracted the largest congregation in the region, and the Langdons built him a gargantuan church to hold it. Beecher's successor at the Park Church, the person who Mark Twain chose to write his eulogy, was the first woman ever ordained in the state of New York, Annis Ford Eastman. Her children, Crystal and Max Eastman, grew up in the Park Church, then went on to become 2 of the most notorious activists of their generation. Max spent large portions of his adulthood in Greenwich Village and the Soviet Union, but considered Mark Twain's Elmira the most radical place he ever lived. Motivated by what Eastman comes to call the gospel of revolt, the Langdons and their friends founded the Elmira Free Academy, a tuition-free, coeducational, and fully integrated primary school. the Elmira Industrial School, a boarding house and trade school run by women for women, which provided refuge from domestic abuse and skills to increase financial independence. And Elmira College, the first U.S. higher education institution to grant degrees to women. Twain absorbed and adopted the culture of Elmira, surprising many by becoming an outspoken advocate for women's suffrage, a patron of African American activists, and eventually a thorn in Teddy Roosevelt's side as he opposed Roosevelt's imperialist campaigns in Asia and the Caribbean. In Elmira, Twain encountered the largest free black population of his lifetime, many of whom left a lasting impression upon his work. In July of 1874, Mary Ann Cord, the African-American cook who lived at Quarry Farm, regaled the Clemens and Cranes families with an account of being forcibly separated from her children at a slave auction, including from her 3-year-old son. That son, Henry Washington, later joined the Union Army Regiment, which was part of Sherman's march through the Carolinas, and was reunited with his mother as part of the army that freed her. After the war, they moved together to Elmira, where Henry purchased a barber shop. It was he who Twain chose to cut his famous hair. After hearing Cord's story, Twain attempted to recreate it in prose, capturing her authentic voice as best he could. It was one of the first things he wrote in the octagonal study, and it was the first thing he ever published in the prestigious Atlantic Monthly. It was also his first dialect story, and the first instance of black vernacular appearing in a premier U.S. literary magazine. Its success changed how Twain conceived of what and who should be represented in American popular culture. Mark Twain was famous before he got to Elmira. But it was this place that shaped the worldview which kept him famous long after he was dead. In Elmira, he wrote surrounded not only by family, but by renegade ministers, women's rights advocates, civil rights activists, prison reformers, socialists, philanthrocapitalists, and educators committed to providing rigorous and innovative opportunities for all. Elmira College and the Center for Mark Twain Studies are the institutional descendants of this extraordinary community, a community that made Mark Twain possible. In his last performance as Mark Twain for our podcast, The American Vandal, Oscar-winning actor Hal Holbrook captures a revealing passage from one of Twain's final works, What is Man?, in which the author describes how individuals are shaped by the places they inhabit and the people with whom they associate.
A man is never anything but what his outside influences have made him. They train him downwards, or they train him upwards, but they train him. They work upon him all the time. It is in his chameleonship that his greatest good fortune lies. He has only to change his habitat, his associations. But the impulse to do it must come from the outside. He cannot originate it himself. Sometimes a very small and accidental thing can furnish him the initiatory impulse and start him on a new road with a new ideal. The chance remark of a sweetheart may water a seed that shall sprout and bloom and flourish and end in producing a surprising fruitage. The history of man is full of such accidents, and the result for that man can be an entire change of his way of life.